Hercule Poirot and the candlestick that pointed out the guilty man. Chapter 1. Lightning in the night. The storm had started just after dinner. The windows of Bellgard Manor, perched atop the Cornish cliffs, rattled in the buffeting wind. The sea, invisible from within, roared with a low bellow that seemed to spring from the abyss itself. Inside, members of the circle gathered around the fire struggled to maintain the composure required by the occasion. The 70th birthday of Lady Evelyn Carroway, matriarch of the Carroway line and hostess of the evening. A woman with a stern face and a firm voice, Lady Evelyn presided over the courtroom with an air of regal authority, like a dethroned queen still dictating in exile. To her right, the family lawyer, Mr. Arthur Drenville, leafed through papers with barely contained concern. To her left, her great-niece, Miss Isabel Carroway, observed everyone with a mixture of distance and distrust. "A perfect night for tragedy," murmured young Sebastian Vale, a poet by profession and occasional drama lover. No one responded to his comment. It was then that the blackout plunged the house into darkness. A scream cut through the darkness like a knife. There was a confusion of footsteps, overturned furniture, a broken lamp. Then a voice everyone recognized, that of the butler Hillgrave, called from the hallway, "Mrs. Carroway, someone has attacked Mr. Drenville." When the power returned, briefly, shaky, thanks to the emergency generators, the lawyer lay lifeless, still seated in his chair, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. A heavy bronze candlestick fallen beside him was still dripping hot wax onto the carpet. Lady Evelyn stood with her dignity intact. Her gaze slowly scanned the room. "No one is leaving this house," he declared, "not until we know who committed this crime." Thus, the next day, amidst persistent rain and still grey skies, a gentleman with a compact figure, an impeccable moustache, and a carefully measured gait arrived at Bellgard Mansion. He introduced himself with a business card embroidered with gilt initials, Mr. Hercule Poirot. He had been summoned by urgent telegram sent by Isabel, who knew the Belgian detective's reputation through friends in London. The local police, overwhelmed by the family's influence and the mansion's closed-off atmosphere, gladly accepted his help. Poirot was welcomed in the great hall by Hillgrave, whose rigid composure barely concealed the nervousness in his eyes. After a brief visual inspection, the kind of inspection one didn't notice until it was too late, Poirot spoke. "My friend, can you tell me if anything has moved since the crime?" "Nothing, sir. The murder room remains intact. Lady Evelyn, personally, ordered it." "Very well," Poirot agreed. "And tell me, where is the candlestick?" "Next to the body, sir." "Where it fell?" Poirot raised an eyebrow, as if the inert, willis object had something to confess. He was then led to the East Library, a room with high ceilings, Persian carpets, and an air of opulent solemnity. The body had already been removed, but the scene spoke for itself. The still-stained armchair, the candlestick inches away, the remains of a broken glass, and, above all, the arrangement of the chairs. Someone, that was obvious, had been standing behind the lawyer when he was killed. Poirot walked slowly. He looked around without touching anything. Then he turned to Hillgrave. "Who was present when the power went out?" "Lady Evelyn, miss," Isabel, Mr. Sebastian Vale, Colonel Maitland, the cat lady, Miss Larchmont, and myself, sir." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. And they were all sitting down. "Yes, sir. Well, except for the Colonel. He'd gone to get another brandy," he said. Poirot turned to the chandelier. He bent down and examined it. Then, with extreme delicacy, he stood up and walked to the window. He looked at the reflection of the room in the steamed glass. A barely perceptible smile touched his lips. "My God, he's starting to talk now. Mister? The chandelier, Hillgrave. It's pointing. Only no one has bothered to look where." And so, with that cryptic remark, Poirot began his elegant dance of deduction. A crime committed in the dark. A circle of cultivated suspects, all with secrets, and an object, inanimate, yes, that seemed to have chosen where it would fall. The Belgian master's research had just begun. Chapter 2. The House of Silence. The second day dawned shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to have crept down from the cliffs to embrace every corner of Bellgard Mansion. The silence in the hallways was almost unnatural. The muffled footsteps on the carpets, the doors creaking suspiciously, the hushed murmurs among the servants. Everything contributed to an atmosphere where the crime was not just a fact, but a presence still there, waiting to be unravelled. Poirot, impeccably dressed in a pale grey suit, walked down the eastern corridor, accompanied by Miss Isabel Carroway. Though young, she possessed the toughness and restraint of a woman accustomed to observing from the sidelines. "I'm glad you came, Monsieur Poirot." The police seemed more interested in appearances than in understanding. "It's a common attitude, mademoiselle. But, as you know, I don't trust appearances. They always cheat." They entered the blue drawing-room, where Poirot had asked everyone present on the night of the crime to gather. The space, with its thick curtains, central fireplace, and portraits of stiff ancestors hanging on the walls, smelled of old wood and a certain tension that not even a fire could dissipate. Lady Evelyn presided, sitting with a poured but untouched cup of tea. "Well, Monsieur Poirot," she said firmly, "you've seen the scene, you've walked through the house. Are you any closer to knowing who killed my lawyer?" Poirot bowed politely. "I'm closer to understanding." "The crime was committed, madam, and that always precedes the who." The lady's eyes sparkled, but she nodded with a small gesture. "Begin, if you wish." Poirot turned to the rest. Colonel Maitland, solidly built and with a square moustache, kept his arms crossed, looking sceptical. Beside him, Miss Larchmont, an eccentric woman with a whispery voice and deep dark circles under her eyes, stroked the onyx ring she always wore. Sebastian Vale stared out the window, distracted, as if already composing the poem of the murder. Hillgrave, standing by the fireplace, watched everyone without blinking. "Let me ask," Poirot began, "who knew that Mr. Drenville planned to speak to Lady Evelyn about revising his will that evening?" A slight flicker among those present. Lady Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "It was a private matter, Poirot. But a private matter is rarely private in a house like this, madame. Wasn't it you yourself who remarked yesterday that the walls have ears? It was Isabel who spoke. I knew it. Mr. Drenville told me about it that afternoon on the terrace. And did you mention it to anyone?" "No." A pause. "Well, maybe I said it out loud when I was talking to Sebastian." "And you, Mr. Vale?" Sebastian shrugged. "I didn't really give it any thought. Wills change." And lawyers die too, apparently. Poirot inclined his head towards Colonel Maitland. And you, sir, where exactly were you when the lights went out? I've already told the police. I was going to get some brandy. I was crossing the dining room when I heard the crash. Poirot nodded slowly, then fixed his gaze on Miss Larchmont. And you, mademoiselle? You were closer to Mr. Drenville, weren't you? I was sitting there embroidering. I don't see how that makes me a suspect. Oh, it doesn't. I'm just checking his position. After all, the killer took advantage of the blackout. The killer knew the layout of the room, knew who would be where. And most of all, knew that Mr. Drenville would be defenceless. Poirot began to walk slowly across the carpet, but there's something else, something curious. The chandelier that fell wasn't in its usual place. I checked it this morning. There are marks on the mantelpiece. The object had been moved before the power went out. I mean, someone had prepared it. A murmur ran through the room. Lady Evelyn paled barely perceptibly. Are you implying that it was a premeditated crime? Poirot turned to her. I'm not implying it, madame. I'm affirming it. A deep silence fell. Hillgrave broke the moment with a slight clearing of his throat. Monsieur Poirot, do you think the murderer is in this room? Poirot smoothed his moustache. I'm convinced of it. The murderer counted with the blackout. The killer knew where his victim would be. And the killer... He paused briefly. He wanted the candlestick to point to something. What? Isabel asked, holding her breath. Poirot smiled as if he already knew the answer, but wasn't ready to share it yet. Ah, mademoiselle, that's part of the game. And believe me, this is a game Poirot always wins. And without further ado, he left the room with his measured stride, leaving behind an atmosphere even denser than before. The House of Silence held secrets, but they had already begun to crack. Chapter 3. Lies Under the Lamp. Poirot examined the desk lamp in his private room, lit despite the natural light that dimly filtered through the misty windows. With great care, he placed beside it a small notepad on which he had begun to list the names of those present, noting beneath each one not facts but impressions, gestures, hesitations, misdirected glances. Mr. Drenville's murder was not a crime of impulse. No, there was planning, preparation, and above all, a mind that wanted to disguise the truth under a cloak of apparent inevitability. A light knock on the door brought him out of his thoughts. "Entrez," he said, without looking. Miss Isabel poked her face out. She was carrying a tray of tea. "I don't trust the service," he explained. "After what happened, I'd rather not have any surprises in his cup." Poirot smiled slightly. "That's very thoughtful of you, mademoiselle. Courtesy and caution are always appreciated." She placed the tray on the table, then stood, as if hesitant, to leave. "Do you already have an idea? Whose was it?" Poirot tilted his head. "Have fragments, mademoiselle. Fragments that must fit together before forming a complete picture. Tell me, how would you describe Mr. Drenville?" Isabel frowned. He was methodical, reserved. A man who lived for documents, not people. He paused. "Not very well liked, if that's what you want to know." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Not very dear to Lady Evelyn. She trusted him. But that's not the same as loving him. I think my aunt feared him a little. Drenville had too much information on all of us. He'd read letters, wills, compromising documents. He knew things. And you, were you afraid of him? Isabel hesitated for only a moment. No, but I didn't tell him more than necessary. Poirot nodded. Do you know anyone who would have a special urgency to have that will? Will it be reviewed? Isabel's lips trembled for a moment. Yes, but I won't say it without proof. Poirot didn't insist. He knew that when emotions were forced, lies took shape more quickly than the truth. When she left, Poirot walked slowly to his trunk, took out a leather folder and extracted a sheet of paper where he had scribbled the positions in the room on the night of the crime. He retraced the location of every chair, every glass, every shadow. Miss Larchmont sitting by the piano, the chandelier off-centre. Why? Later, in the library, Poirot asked to speak with the eccentric Miss Larchmont, who immediately accepted, although her eyes moved nervously, like those of someone who hears things that others do not. Do you suspect me, Monsieur Poirot? I don't suspect, mademoiselle. Noticed, and you, like everyone else, were in the room when the lights went out. I'm interested in what saw. The felt. The woman placed a hand on the pendant she always wore, a dark jade sphere. I felt someone moving right behind me. Quick footsteps, a strong waft of perfume. Then silence, and the crash. Perfume? Yes. Sweet, like lavender mixed with something else. Bitter. Poirot closed his eyes. That was a note that couldn't be found in any police file. Have you smelled it before? No, but I know it wasn't from any woman in this house. Lady Evelyn never wears perfume. And Isabel, well, she smells of ink and damp earth, not flowers. Poirot bowed his head in thanks. He then asked to speak to Colonel Maitland. The man arrived, with a military stride and a firm voice. Monsieur Poirot, I don't know how I can help you. I've already given my testimony. That's precisely why I called you, mon colonel, because our testimony is the only one that cannot be verified. Maitland frowned. Are you saying I'm lying? I'm saying that no one saw you when the crime occurred. And yet you claim to have been in the dining room looking for brandy. And it's the truth. Where is that bottle? Empty. I found it and left it there. Poirot stared at him. Curious. Hillgrave told me this morning that the bottle was still sealed. Maitland didn't reply. His lips tightened, but he didn't say another word. He just got up and left without asking permission. Poirot watched him leave. The truth, like good brandy, is not found where it is said, but where it is served. Later, in the dimness of his room, Poirot replayed the crime scene in his mind. The faces, the glances, the chandelier, the perfume. There were lies floating in that house like invisible gas, but he had already lit the flame. Chapter 4. The Perfume in the Shadow. Night had fallen again on Bellgard Mansion, with the same ominous density as before. The electric lights, restored but unsteady, flickered as if hesitant to stay on. Poirot, standing on the threshold of the drawing-room, looked at the candlesticks lined up on the mantelpiece, but not at the one that had been used as a weapon. That one, of course, was still in police custody. A misplaced chandelier, a perfume without an owner, and a killer who knew the rhythm of the blackout. Poirot walked slowly towards the window. where the curtain still bore a faint trace of hardened wax. A small detail, insignificant to anyone's eyes. But for Poirot, nothing was insignificant. He was interrupted by Hillgrave, the butler, who appeared with his mechanical gait and clasped hands. "Monsieur Poirot, Lady Evelyn requests your presence," in her private study. Poirot nodded politely. "Thank you, Hillgrave. I'm at your service." The study was decorated with the same severe elegance as the rest of the house. Walls covered in burgundy velvet, an antique desk, shelves of law books, and family portraits framed in tarnished gilt. Lady Evelyn was waiting for him seated, holding a glass of sherry. "Monsieur Poirot," he began bluntly, "I didn't ask you here to discuss details. I asked you here to sort this out. Discreetly, my family can't afford a scandal." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madam, the discretion. It's one of my most cultivated qualities. But you've called me to uncover the truth. Sometimes truth and discretion don't mix well." She took a sip of sherry, before setting the glass down decisively. "Do you think this has to do with the will?" "I don't think so. I observe. And what I've observed leads me to think the will was the trigger, but not the sole cause. There are more layers, madam." Lady Evelyn pressed her lips together. "I'll tell you something. Drenville had hinted that he detected irregularities in the family accounts. He didn't tell me what they were, but he seemed certain that someone, one of our own, had systematically diverted funds. Interesting. And did he mention who he suspected? No, but he looked at me in a way like he expected me to already know." Poirot thanked him with a slight gesture, then added, "Do you wear perfume, madame?" She looked at him as if the question was offensive. "Never. My mother used to say that perfume is a mask. I prefer people to smell me just like I am." Poirot nodded slowly. "An admirable principle, although sometimes a mask reveals more than it conceals." Leaving the study, Poirot met Isabelle in the corridor. "Would you mind walking with me for a few minutes, mademoiselle?" She nodded and followed him. They walked to the greenhouse, the only place still warm thanks to the moisture trapped during the day. Between the shadows of the tropical plants, Poirot spoke. "The perfume someone smelled the night of the crime. Does it sound familiar?" Isabelle shook her head. "No. Why do you ask?" "Because whoever used it didn't want to leave a pleasant scent. He wanted confused perfume in a house without perfumed women. A message, perhaps. A distraction, no doubt." She stopped next to a bougainvillea and whispered, "Sebastian carries a small bottle in his briefcase. He uses it sometimes as if it were part of his artistic pose. He says he found it at a flea market in Morocco." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Perfume on a poet? What a surprise! Do you think it was him?" "I think that's someone. He wants us to think it was him. And that interests me more." The next day, Poirot asked to search Sebastian Vale's personal effects. The young man didn't object, although his expression was one of artistic annoyance. "Here you go. But if you were hoping to find criminal verses, I'm afraid I'll disappoint you." Poirot meticulously examined the contents. Notebooks with scribbles, a book by Rimbaud, a gold fountain pen, and, in a purple velvet case, a bottle. He uncorked it and smelled it. Lavender, and something else, bitter musk. "Curious," said Poirot, closing the bottle. "Was this perfume worn on the night of the crime?" "No, I haven't opened it in weeks. I carry it more for aesthetic reasons than for use. You can ask anyone." Poirot didn't reply. He simply returned each object to its place and withdrew. But as he left, he glanced toward the mantelpiece, where a slightly askew mirror hung. The killer left more than perfume. He left an image, distorted, but the true image is yet to be revealed. In the darkness of a windowless corridor, Poirot muttered to himself, "The shadow that walks with perfume will soon leave traces." Chapter 5. The Voice That Was Missing at Dinner. The dining room at Bellgard Manor, with its long table like a ceremonial coffin, and its suspended chandeliers like silent guardians, had witnessed many formal dinners. But tonight's dinner was held under an almost physical tension. Every sound, the tapping of a fork, the scraping of a glass, Lady Evelyn's barely suppressed cough, seemed to multiply in the air, as if the house itself were listening. Poirot stood at the end of the table, observing each diner with his characteristic calm, while eating with small, precise movements, as if dinner were part of an experiment. "Don't you find it curious, Mademoiselle Isabelle," he said suddenly, without taking his eyes off his plate, "that in this house, where every word weighs like a confession, someone has remained curiously silent?" Isabelle looked at him in bewilderment. "What do you mean?" Poirot looked up. Slowly, his finger pointed to the other end of the table. "To you, Hillgrave." The butler, who had been overseeing dinner from his usual corner by the door, barely flinched. "I haven't been questioned, sir. I didn't wish to intrude." Poirot wiped his lips with his napkin. "And yet I was in the room when the lights went out. I was as close as anyone. I think it's time to hear his voice." Hillgrave nodded and approached slowly. His face, always serene, now showed a barely perceptible shadow of discomfort. "I can tell you, Monsieur Poirot, that when the blackout occurred, I distinctly heard a sharp bang, followed by the sound of a glass breaking, then hurried footsteps towards the door, and then silence." What direction were those steps taking? "Toward the side corridor, the one that leads to the lobby." Poirot nodded. "And you moved?" "No, sir. I stood still. I swear on my honour, Dum." Evelyn chimed in from her seat, her voice like a snap of steel. "Are you suggesting that Hillgrave has been withholding information?" "I'm not suggesting anything, madam," Poirot replied gently. "I'm just puzzled that a man who heard footsteps and didn't report them beforehand nor remember them. Memory is a curious art. Sometimes it flourishes under the right pressure." Hillgrave looked down. "I didn't mean to hinder the investigation. I didn't think it was relevant. But everything is relevant when it comes to death." The rest of the dinner passed amidst forced comments and spoons that stopped mid-course. When Lady Evelyn finally stood and announced the end of the evening, the guests dispersed into small groups, like pieces on a chessboard being haphazardly shuffled. Poirot returned to the library, where a detail more disturbing than any of the testimonies awaited him: the absence, more precisely, the absence of a document. Hours earlier, he had left on the table a copy of the old will that Hillgrave had given him privately, with Lady Evelyn's permission. Now it was gone. The rest of the papers were still there, the books open as before, but that one page was gone. Poirot immediately called Isabelle, who arrived still wearing her jacket. "Have you touched anything in this room, mademoiselle?" "No, sir." "What's gone missing?" "A copy of the previous will, the one that will be replaced, or would have been replaced, if Mr. Drenville hadn't been murdered." Isabelle frowned. "Do you think someone didn't want you to see that document?" Poirot looked around the room. "I think someone them's what that document proves, not because of what it says, but because of what omitted." At that moment, the door opened and Colonel Maitland entered, unannounced. "Have you lost something, Monsieur Poirot?" "Just one piece of the puzzle." "But sometimes, Colonel, a single piece reveals the whole picture." Maitland approached the fire. "I'm not a puzzle man. I prefer bullets, more direct." And yet, in this case, it was a candlestick that killed, not a bullet. Maitland looked at him sharply. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot smiled. "No! I'm just wondering why you said you found an empty bottle when it was actually still sealed." A dense silence. "I opened it later," the Colonel said after a moment. "I was nervous. I didn't want them to know." Poirot said nothing more. He just watched him leave the room. Then he returned to his notebook. He drew a circle. Inside, he wrote 5 names, and next to it, he wrote in small letters. "One of them doesn't speak like the others. One lies with every gesture. But it's the absence of a voice that screams the loudest." Poirot closed the notebook. The voice that was missing during dinner could be the key. Chapter 6. The Will That No One Signed. The next morning, the mansion awoke to a leaden sky that seemed to reflect the growing weight of the mystery looming over its walls. The atmosphere, like the general mood, oscillated between silent tension and a still undefined threat. Every face, every conversation had become more calculated. People spoke in whispers. People walked more carefully. At Bellgard Mansion, even the silence seemed a witness. Poirot, already impeccably dressed in his light blue suit and pin-striped tie, was in the music room, inspecting a photograph frame that had fallen onto the mantelpiece. The image showed Lady Evelyn with her late husband and a teenage Isabelle, smiling with shy anticipation. The frame, oddly enough, was dusty only on one edge, as if someone had recently tampered with it. "Interesting," Poirot murmured. "Here, too, stories are told without words." He was interrupted by Isabelle, who arrived with a leather folder under her arm. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, taking a deep breath. "I found this among the books in Drenville's office. I didn't notice it before. I think it's relevant." Poirot took the folder and opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of the amended will with handwritten notes in red pencil. "Do you recognize this letter?" I think it's Drenville's," Isabelle said. "The notes indicate a significant change in the distribution of assets. Specifically, it reduced Sebastian Vale's stake and eliminated Miss Larchmont entirely." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Oh la la, now that's a reason. And the strangest thing," Isabelle added, almost in a whisper, the document isn't signed. It's just dated, the same night as the murder." Poirot gently closed the folder. "The will that no one signed, or that it was not allowed to sign. That changes everything, mademoiselle. Do you think this motivated the crime? I think whoever wrote it died before signing it. and that someone I expected that it was so. Poirot asked Isabel not to mention the discovery to anyone yet. With the document in hand, he went into the living room, where he found Miss Larchmont sitting by the piano, humming a tuneless melody. Her fingers trembled on the keys, but she pressed none. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, taking the seat opposite her, "may I ask you something?" "It already does, Monsieur Poirot. Did you know that Mr. Drunville was planning to remove you from the will?" The woman looked at him with eyes that instantly darkened. "What? What does he say?" Poirot took the sheet of paper out of the folder and showed it to him without allowing him to take it. "This copy clearly indicates that. Did you know that? No, that's absurd. Lady Evelyn always considered me part of this household. I was the only one who looked after her when she was ill last winter." "I don't doubt it, but Drenville wasn't acting out of affection, but out of deeds. Can you tell me, then, how he justifies an inheritance of over £50,000 without any blood ties?" She sat up, pale. "She promised me. Evelyn promised me years ago. What if Drenville had decided that promise was a mistake?" Miss Larchmont swayed for a moment, then sank back into the chair. "I didn't know. I swear. I thought everything was fine." Poirot studied her closely. The crisis seemed genuine, but something didn't add up. Was it indignation, fear, or the bewilderment of a player who hadn't expected that card in the deck? Later, Poirot visited Sebastian Vale, who was in the West Gallery, drawing a silhouette of Isabel in charcoal. "And what are you looking for now, Monsieur Poirot?" "Motifs in portraits." "I'm only interested in what the line conceals," Poirot replied, with a restrained smile. "Did you know that the will that benefited you was about to be changed?" Sebastian shrugged. "Drenville never could stand me. If he cut me out of the will, I wasn't surprised. Frankly, I expected him to. That's why I wrote a poem called Sterile Inheritance." Poirot nodded slowly. But he didn't say it the night of the crime. And what would that have achieved? Only that Evelyn would have gotten angry. She believes in blood, not muses. Funny, because his will seemed to go against both of those things. Sebastian stared at him. "Are you implying that I had something to do with Drenville's death?" "I'm not insinuating, sir. I'm just picking up pieces." Upon returning to his room, Poirot laid out all the elements on his desk: the unsigned will, the moved candlestick, the strange perfume, the omitted words, and now a chain of intertwined motivations. A document without a signature is like a crime without a confession, but in both cases there is always an intention. He took his notebook and wrote in firm handwriting. The murderer didn't need to erase his name from the will. He just needed to make sure it was never signed. Poirot closed the notebook with precision. The circle was beginning to close. Do we now generate the Chapter 7? The servant who did not ring the bell. Chapter 7. The servant who did not ring the bell. Dawn brought with it a fine, steady rain, which seemed to slowly erase the outlines of the mansion and make its silhouette even more isolated from the outside world. Poirot sat in the dining room, alone, in front of a cup of hot chocolate that had cooled without him even touching it. In his mind, the elements of the crime were beginning to take on fixed positions, like pieces that stopped spinning in the air and settled on the chessboard. The key I knew was not only in what had happened, but in what had not happened. And the detail that came back to his mind again and again was one that everyone overlooked. No one had rung the service bell when Drenville's body was discovered. In a house of that calibre, the ringing of the bell was as common as that of a clock striking the hour. Every meal, every request for tea, every announcement of a visitor began with a ring. Why then, at the most serious moment, when the crime was discovered, had no one resorted to the usual method? Poirot called Hillgrave that same morning. The butler appeared punctually, his bearing upright and his hands clasped, but the gleam in his eyes was different. He was worried. "Monsieur Poirot," he said neutrally, "do you want anything in particular?" "Just one question, Hillgrave. The night of the crime. Why wasn't the service bell rung for help?" The butler blinked. I assumed that given the seriousness of the situation, such a trivial act was inappropriate. "Trivial?" Poirot repeated softly. "And aren't you the one who maintains that protocol in this house is inviolable?" Hillgrave did not immediately respond. Miss Isabel screamed. "I came. It seemed the natural thing to do." "Yes, very natural. Except that someone like you, so exacting, so attached to routine, would omit what you've done for 27 years. That makes me think it wasn't an omission. It was a decision." Hillgrave remained motionless, but his jaw tightened. Poirot continued. "Were you already in the hallway when the murder occurred?" "No, sir. I was standing by the living-room door, as usual." Poirot stared at him. Was his back to the rest? Yeah. Then he heard the crash. He heard the glass break. And yet he didn't hear the footsteps. Hillgrave pressed his lips together. "I said I heard them. Last night. At dinner. When he asked me. Yeah. But he offered that information after I hinted at it. Before, you omitted it. Why? The silence that followed was long and heavy. Finally, Hillgrave spoke. "I didn't want to involve Colonel Maitland." Poirot blinked. Why protect him? Because I saw him leave the living room seconds after the crash. I saw it with my own eyes. But when he came back, he said he was in the dining room. Poirot stood still. "And you believed that lie?" "No, but it's not my place to discredit a guest of Lady Evelyn. My duty is to this house." Poirot approached the window. Hillgrave's reflection in the glass was tense, almost rigid. "You protected a man out of respect for the power structure, but you made a mistake. You thought the truth could be postponed, but it can't. It only hides, and in doing so, it becomes more dangerous." After Hillgrave left, Poirot requested a meeting with Colonel Maitland. This time there was no cordiality in the greeting. "Colonel," Poirot began, "I have learned that you were not in the dining room at the time of the crime, as you stated." Maitland frowned. "Who says that?" "It doesn't matter. The important thing is that they saw him leave the room." "Can you explain that?" The soldier stood firm. "I went to the dining room, yes, but I remembered leaving my cigarette case in the living room, so I came back, and then the blackout happened." "And did you see anything?" "No, it was pitch black. It scared me, I admit. That's why I left quickly." Poirot said nothing for a moment, then coldly, A lie, Colonel, has 2 legs shorter than a crippled soldier. If you keep dragging it around, you'll end up falling on it." Maitland gritted his teeth. "Are you implying that I killed him?" "No, monsieur. I'm implying that saw everything and decided not to intervene. That's why he ran away. That's why he lied." The Colonel took a step forward. "And if I saw it, do you think I would just stand there and do nothing? If you owe someone in this house, or are afraid of being linked to something shady." "Yeah, I think I could keep quiet." Maitland's response was to slam the door out of the room. Poirot didn't flinch. He just muttered to himself, "Now we have a missing will. A witness who didn't speak, and another who fled. The crime is beginning to take shape, but the shadow that moved between them is still missing, with scent and purpose." He wrote one last note in his notebook before closing it. The murderer trusted in silence, but forgot that silences, like servants who don't ring bells, also speak. Chapter 8. The Key Nobody Asked For. The rain persisted with an almost symbolic constancy, as if the sky were determined to wash away the truths hidden behind the walls of Bellgard Mansion. Poirot, after a light breakfast of crisp toast and a perfectly boiled egg, not out of appetite but out of discipline, requested access to the staff quarters. It was unusual for a distinguished guest to request such a thing, but Lady Evelyn, with a curt expression and barely veiled suspicion, agreed without objection. "It was Hillgrave who drove it. Are you looking for something in particular, monsieur?" "Poirot, I seek what no one else has sought, Hillgrave. A simple key." "What key, sir?" "That's precisely the point. The one that nobody asked for." The staff quarters were austere, extremely clean. Poirot stopped in front of a small board hanging next to the maintenance room door. It contained numbered brass tags corresponding to each important lock in the house. One row was empty. "Is that key in use?" Hillgrave looked at the gap with mild surprise. "That belongs in the second office. No one has asked for it since Lady Evelyn's husband died 5 years ago. It's in storage. Or at least it should be. Who has access to that room?" "Just me, sir." "But the key was in the bottom drawer. I checked last week." Poirot raised his eyebrows slowly. "Then someone took it after, and no one returned it. There was no reason to do it." "Oh, but in this house nothing happens without reason any more." Poirot asked to be shown the locked office. Hillgrave led him down a side corridor to a door with a nameplate that simply read, "Office." The lock had accumulated dust on the frame, but the handprint on the handle was fresh. "Can you open it?" Hillgrave nodded, and after a brief search among his master keys, forced entry. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dry wood. There were shelves lined with accounting files, a cloth-covered Olivetti typewriter, and a locked safe built into the wall. Poirot inspected without touching. His gaze fell on a slightly displaced filing cabinet. He gently pushed it aside and discovered a folder labelled in clear print, "Caraway Trust, Parcel 17B. "Funny," he murmured. "This shouldn't have gone out of print." He opened the folder. Inside were papers signed by Drenville, property plans, and a note. "Consult with Ellie about secret transfer. Do not register yet." Poirot frowned. This is what someone wanted to hide. "What does it mean?" Hillgrave asked. "It means that Mr. Drenville had discovered an irregular transfer of property, one involving assets outside the main will. This, mon ami, it is not a theft of inheritance, it's a silent detour, and whoever did it knew Drenville was about to speak." Poirot ordered that nothing be touched and returned directly to Lady Evelyn. He found her by the fireplace in the main drawing-room, leafing through a book that, judging by the thickness of the dust, hadn't been touched for years. "Madame, may I ask you a direct question?" Poirot said without preamble. "Who was managing Plot 17b?" She looked up slowly. She didn't seem surprised by the mention. That was in Mr. Drenville's hands. He was the only one who knew the full details. And did you know that there was an unregistered transfer of that asset? A tense silence. "No, but I'm beginning to understand that he had his own intentions." Poirot watched her sharply. "Madame, you didn't kill Drenville, but your silence has served the one who did." She slowly closed the book. "Do you know who it was?" Poirot nodded very slightly. "Almost. There's still one more piece to turn, and that piece is stained with perfume and wedged in the shadow of the key no one asked for." Later, Poirot asked to talk to Isabelle in the greenhouse. He found her there, watering the orchids with the calmness of someone who needs to do something with their hands to stop them from thinking. "Mademoiselle, have you ever heard of Plot 17b? Isabelle tensed. "Yes. My mother inherited it, but when she died, Lady Evelyn said the property had been sold to cover debts. Curious. The documents say it was never formally transferred, and that someone falsified its sale." Isabelle's eyes widened. "What are you implying?" Poirot smiled softly. "That his mother was deprived of an asset, that Mr. Drenville was about to right that wrong, and that someone stopped him before he could sign anything." Isabelle remained silent. "And that person," Poirot added gravely, "had access to the key. He had an ulterior motive. And now he's caught between a truth he can no longer silence and a crime he thought was perfect." Isabelle whispered, "Are you going to tell everyone?" "In due time, mademoiselle. First, I must gather the players. The final game is about to begin." Chapter 9. The meeting in the Hall of Portraits. The hall clock struck 8 o'clock as Hillgrave made his ceremonial round of the mansion, informing each guest that Monsieur Hercule Poirot desired your immediate presence in the portrait room. It wasn't a request. It was a call. One by one, the inhabitants of Bellgard entered with tense expressions, shifty gazes, or in Colonel Maitland's case, an arched eyebrow of defiant scepticism. The drawing-room, a gallery flanked by portraits of caraways from generations past, offered a sombre setting for what everyone sensed was a reckoning. Poirot received them standing under the oval portrait of Sir Reginald Carroway, whose stern expression seemed to approve the solemnity of the moment. "My lords and ladies," Poirot said calmly but firmly, "the time has come to shed light on the shadows that have contaminated this house. Mr. Drenville's death was not an accident, nor an impulsive reaction. It was the result of a premeditated decision coldly executed and cunningly concealed." Lady Evelyn, sitting upright in the centre, barely bowed her head. "And have you put all the pieces together, Monsieur Poirot?" "Almost all of them, madame. But as with any puzzle, The key isn't in the number of pieces, but in their exact placement. And now, allow me to reconstruct the crime." Poirot began to walk slowly around the room, like an actor at the climax of his monologue, each word measured to the millimetre. Mr. Drenville discovered that the property known as Parcel 17B had not been sold legally. He learned that it had been transferred irregularly, and that one of the people here had access to the necessary documentation to conceal that fact. Eyes moved to Lady Evelyn, then to Hillgrave, then to Isabel. No one spoke. On the night of the murder, Drenville planned to confront Lady Evelyn and present the truth. But I couldn't allow that to happen. Someone took the key to the second office, a key that hadn't been touched for years, and retrieved incriminating documents. Then they deliberately placed the chandelier in an unusual position. They set it up. Poirot stopped in front of Sebastian Vale, and like every great crime, I needed a distraction, an unusual scent, a perfume no one in this house wears. Except you. That doesn't prove anything, Sebastian snapped. I never used it. I've said it 1,000 times. But it was in its case. And what's more, someone deliberately applied it before the crime. Miss Larchmont smelled it. It's not direct evidence, but it is a clue to tampering. Someone wanted to make you look more suspicious than you were. Poirot turned to Miss Larchmont. "And you, mademoiselle, did you know that the New Testament excluded you completely?" "No, I didn't know until you said it." "Are you sure?" "Because according to the fingerprints on the missing copy, which casually it later appeared in her sewing box, you were the one who hid it." The woman turned pale. "I only hid it because I was afraid they'd think I had a motive." "Exactly. And in doing so, he contributed to the smokescreen the killer needed." Poirot now turned to Hillgrave. "You heard the assassin's footsteps, and you kept silent. You lied about the bell. And you omitted that you saw Colonel Maitland leave the hall just after the knock. Why? Because the Colonel saved my life in Algeria," Hillgrave replied quietly. "I owe him everything. I couldn't incriminate him, even though I doubted him." Poirot nodded gravely. "But Colonel Maitland didn't kill Mr. Drenville. He didn't have access to the key. He didn't know the records. He didn't have a direct inheritance to lose. But someone did have it." Poirot walked slowly to the opposite end of the room and stopped in front of Isabel Carroway. The silence was absolute. You knew that Parcel 17B was rightfully yours. You knew that Mr. Drenville planned to return it legally. But you also knew that if he discovered that you had forged your mother's signature years ago to avoid taxes, it would all fall on you. You had access to the papers. You knew where the key was. You knew the living room routine. And above all, you knew the power of the blackout. Isabel stood still. Not a tear, not a denial. It was you who placed the candlestick in the corner. You who entered the secret office. You who sprayed the perfume on your scarf and left it near Sebastian to incriminate him. You who killed the only man who knew what you had really done. A break. Isabel took a deep breath. Then she spoke in a soft, almost dignified voice. "Out of greed. I did it for justice. That land was ours. My mother died believing it had been stolen from her. And Drenville, he wasn't going to give it back. He wanted to use it to blackmail Lady Evelyn. I got ahead of myself." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. "Maybe, but no one gets ahead of death without paying the price." Lady Evelyn sat up slowly. She didn't say a word. She simply removed the family ring from her finger and placed it on the table, like an unspoken sentence. Isabel was escorted without resistance, and in the Hall of Portraits, the echo of the crime finally dissipated. Chapter 110. The Moustache Reflection and the Nature of Deception. The Bellgard mansion had returned, at least in appearance, to calm. The staff walked through the corridors in silence, their eyes lowered. The rain had stopped, and the air entering through the half-open windows carried with it a fresh, earthy scent, as if the house itself were breathing a sigh of relief. But for Hercule Poirot, there were still unfinished thoughts, loose ends that required the final polish that only his meticulous mind knew how to apply. He was in Lady Evelyn's study, alone this time, sitting in the armchair Drenville usually occupied. On the small table in front of him, a cup of tea was cooling, its reflection distorted in the silver of a spoon. Poirot gazed at it as if the object were speaking to him. "Funny," he murmured. "It's always the reflection that betrays us before the face." Hillgrave knocked on the door and entered with a tray. "Your luggage has been prepared, Monsieur Poirot. The car will be ready in an hour." "Thank you, Hillgrave." "How is Lady Evelyn?" "She hasn't left her room. She asked not to be disturbed." Poirot nodded gravely. "You've lost more than a lawyer, haven't you?" The butler hesitated. Mr. Drenville was, for many years, the only voice that questioned her decisions. Although she wouldn't admit it, she depended on him more than she realized. Poirot let silence fill the space for a few seconds. "And you, Hillgrave, how do you feel after all this?" The butler looked at him with something very like humanity in his tired eyes. "Relieved, sir, because the truth, though painful, has at least been told. And here, that doesn't happen often." Poirot stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the drenched garden. Then he turned slowly. Miss Isabel, intelligent, determined, and deeply misguided. Do you think he doesn't regret it? Oh, mon ami, I'm sure it will. Remorse will come like dampness to these walls, slow, insidious, and without the possibility of stopping. But in his mind, he still believes that I was right, and that's more dangerous than the crime itself. And justice? Hillgrave asked. Has it triumphed? Poirot remained silent. Then he answered calmly. Justice, monsieur, is like the balance of a scale. It doesn't always tip where we'd like, but sooner or later it stabilizes. Isabel will be judged, yes, but the true punishment has already begun within her. No murderer escapes his conscience. When Poirot descended the stairs into the hall, he found Colonel Maitland waiting for him with a glass of brandy in his hand. I owe you an apology, Poirot, he said tersely, for doubting you, and for my silence. Poirot nodded, not wishing to aggravate the moment. We all keep silences, Colonel. The important thing is knowing when to break them. Do you think I'll ever sleep peacefully again? Possibly. But first you must learn to forgive yourself. Not for what you did, but for what you didn't dare prevent. The car was already waiting in the driveway. As Hillgrave closed the suitcase in the trunk, Miss Larchmont appeared discreetly, dressed in grey, as if trying to fade into the day. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you for not dragging us all into the mud." Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle, I don't litter, I just clean." She smiled faintly and disappeared down the corridor like a ghost that had finally been set free. When Poirot got into the car, he arranged himself neatly, adjusted the crease in his trousers, and took out his notebook. In it he wrote in his meticulous handwriting, "The crime was not committed out of ambition or hatred, but out of a misguided desire for justice. Isabel Carroway didn't kill for money. She killed for an emotional inheritance, and that condemns her more deeply than any court could." He closed the notebook. He looked around the mansion one last time. Then he murmured, "The little grey cells have worked well, but the human soul, that one always escapes through some crack." The car started driving off, leaving behind the mansion, the portraits, the lies, and a crime that had been born in the past but demanded truth in the present. And so, like so many times before, Hercule Poirot walked away with his moustache immaculate and his conscience once again in order. Chapter 11. The Echo That Didn't Say Goodbye. The car moved along the gravel road as the Bellgard mansion faded behind the damp trees. Hercule Poirot, elegantly settled in the back seat, had his hands folded on his cane and his face turned toward the window. But he wasn't contemplating the landscape. His gaze was anchored by an idea that still vibrated faintly, like an unanswered echo. An echo, something that didn't say goodbye. Barely 10 minutes into the journey, Poirot banged on the glass partition with his walking stick. "Stop, please." The driver obeyed, visibly confused, but Poirot was already getting out. He walked around the vehicle and leaned toward the driver's window. "Wait for me at the entrance to the forest. I won't be long." Without breaking stride, he walked back to the mansion. This time not through the grand front door, but along a side path that led to the old sheds. He passed the dried-up fountain and turned toward the back, where a rusty bell hung that had, decades ago, been used to summon service from the gardens. There, under a mouldy eaves, was the greenhouse, the same place where he had spoken to Isabel, and where something had seemed strange to him, too tidy. He pushed open the glass door, which creaked with protests, and entered. The air was impregnated with humidity and a scent that was not vegetal musk. Poirot walked to the corner where gardening tools, empty flower pots, and a workbench were piled up. There was an open box with torn labels containing chemicals, fertilizers, and, even stranger, a small bottle of red ink. He examined her. Ink. Not bleed, but useful for a signature. Poirot let out a sigh. In the distance, thunder murmured. He returned to the interior of the house, where Hillgrave greeted him with barely concealed astonishment. "Monsieur Poirot, have you forgotten something?" "No, my friend. Something hasn't said goodbye to me, yet." He went uninvited to Lady Evelyn's office. He knocked once and entered. He found her sitting in the shadows, holding the same book. "I didn't expect to see him again," she said without looking up. "And yet, here I am, because there's something that doesn't add up." something I haven't wanted to think about, but it stuck as an incomplete signature. Lady Evelyn slowly closed the book. "What did you discover?" Poirot looked at her gravely. "That the copy of the will I received was not written in black legal ink, nor with a fountain pen. It was made with stationery ink, the same one I found in the greenhouse." Lady Evelyn did not react, and I also noticed that Drenville was a stickler for organisation. He would never have left documents with crossed-out marks or crooked margins. But that copy, it had both. It wasn't his, it was a forgery. A slight shudder ran across the woman's face. So, Mademoiselle Isabelle never saw that copy. She didn't take it. She didn't hide it. She didn't invent it. Someone placed it in his possession after the crime. And now I think I know who. Poirot took out his notebook and placed it on the table. The crime was committed by Isabelle. That's still true. But the decision to point her out, to guide every clue towards her with surgical precision, she was yours, madam. Lady Evelyn finally looked up. What would I gain from that? The same thing you've always had. Control. Because you, sir, knew from the beginning that Isabelle had done it. You heard her crying that morning. You saw her cleaning her gloves in the gallery bathroom. But you didn't report her. Instead, you manipulated the circumstances, so the truth would come out when you consider it necessary, on their own terms. And that makes me a criminal? Poirot tilted his head. No, but it makes her a silent accomplice to a tragedy. You didn't kill her with the candlestick, but you did lay the rug out for Isabelle's downfall. The public humiliation, the social punishment, that was yours. Lady Evelyn stood slowly. Her eyes, for the first time, looked truly old. She dishonoured this family. She destroyed our name. She betrayed her mother. And you expected me to protect her. Poirot looked at her with a mixture of pity and sadness. I didn't expect perfect justice, but yes, a little imperfect compassion. Lady Evelyn turned to the window. Broken families don't need sympathy. They need silence. Poirot didn't reply. He just took his notebook, bowed with painful politeness, and left without another word. When he got back into the car and drove away from the mansion for the second time, he finally felt like the story had ended. Not with justice, not with redemption, but with understanding. And that, in Poirot's world, was sometimes the only thing possible. Chapter 12. The Last Whisper in the Gallery. The train to London rattled steadily, a mechanical beat that accompanied Hercule Poirot's meditative silence. He sat in the first-class compartment, perfectly seated, his walking stick resting between his knees and his hat carefully placed on the adjacent seat. Through the window, the Cornish fields faded away, as if they too wanted to leave Bellgard, house behind. But Poirot's mind did not allow itself such a luxury. The story was still throbbing inside him. There was something still unfinished, a sentence that didn't end, a look that hadn't been fully understood. He took out his notebook. He flipped through the pages slowly, pausing on the last sentence Id had written. It wasn't the crime that defined this story, but how everyone responded to it. Something else was missing. A final echo, a forgotten whisper. Poirot closed the notebook with a soft click. A week later, in London, Poirot strolled leisurely through a private art gallery in Mayfair, accompanied by his old friend Inspector Japp. The gallery, discreet and somewhat forgotten by the press, was hosting a temporary exhibition of family portraits from noble houses in the south of England. "So, what are we doing here, Poirot?" Japp asked, looking at a dusty canvas of a Victorian lady. "My friend, a detective never completely abandons a case. He only keeps it until the last shadow dissolves." Poirot stopped before a painting. He looked at it intently. The sign read, "Lady Caraway and her niece Isabel. Oil painting, 1908. In the painting, Isabel was barely 6 years old. Her face, like that of all children painted at that time, had a slightly theatrical innocence. But her eyes— "Regardez bien," murmured Poirot. "You see," Japp narrowed his eyes. "The frame? It's crooked. Non, at the company, in the lower right corner, the name of the painter E.L. Caraway." "Evelyn?" Japp said in surprise. "Did Lady Evelyn paint this?" Poirot nodded. "She signed it. But what interests me is not that she painted it, but as because this painting speaks to me, Inspector. It tells me that she already wanted to control Isabel's image. The position, the light, the expression, everything was chosen. And what does that have to do with the murder? All Lady Evelyn didn't just control documents, wills, and servants. She controlled narratives. And her most elaborate was Isabel, a girl moulded as a legacy, but never loved as a person." Japp was silent for a moment. "And you think that pushed Isabel to—" "I don't excuse the crime, but I do understand it. Isabel lived trapped in the frame Evelyn painted for her, and when she wanted to get out, when she wanted to correct her mother's stolen past, I no longer distinguish justice from revenge." Japp took a deep breath. Then he asked, "And Lady Evelyn? What about her?" Poirot looked at the painting one last time. The girl's eyes seemed to follow him, but not with innocence. "With weight. Lady Evelyn will live surrounded by silence. There will be no charges against her. No one can arrest someone for orchestrating the truth with words. But there are convictions that don't require bars." As he left the gallery, Poirot paused for a moment at the foot of the steps. He looked up at the London sky, grey, vast, indifferent. Human justice, my dear Japp, is dull and blind. But the soul, that one sees clearly. And sometimes he punishes with more subtlety than a judge. Japp didn't reply. He just lit a cigarette and walked on in silence. And Poirot, with his elegant walking stick and his moustache intact, disappeared into the streets like an exact shadow. Like the last whisper of a truth already spoken. Chapter 13. The Wind That Closed. The Door. 3 days after Poirot's visit to the Mayfair Gallery, an unreturned envelope was slipped under the door of his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions. The butler, Georges, found it at dawn, and after examining it with the suspicion he had learned from years of service to the detective, placed it on the breakfast tray next to the newspaper and the carefully measured sugar. Poirot, still in his silk dressing-gown and slippers, took it with his usual delicacy. The paper was expensive linen. The handwriting was carefully rounded. It only contained one sentence. "The whole truth has not yet emerged from the portrait." Poirot remained motionless for a few seconds. Then, very slowly, he folded the paper and slipped it into the inside pocket of his dressing gown. "George," he said in a level voice, "have my dark grey suit ready. And if you would be so kind, call Mrs. Blount, the curator at the gallery in Mayfair. Tell her I wish to see Lady Evelyn's portrait again." "The niece's?" "No, the other. The portrait of Lady Evelyn alone hung in a side aisle of the gallery, away from the main display. Few people looked at it. It was not a large painting. The palette was cold, the background blurred, and the lady's face was rigid, almost expressionless. But Poirot stood before it for almost 20 minutes without moving. "Are you looking at anything in particular?" asked Curator Blount, who had approached unannounced. "Oui, I'm watching what noise in the box." The woman raised an eyebrow. "A composition error." Poirot shook his head gently. "A deliberate omission. This portrait was painted after the death of Lady Evelyn's husband. She had commissioned a series to restore the family image, she said. But look here." He pointed with the tip of his cane to the lower right-hand corner, the same armchair that appears in Isabel's portrait. Same angle, but in this one, there's something erased. Blount approached. A trace of a brush. No, a symbol, a brooch. Blount narrowed his eyes. "My God, you're right. There's pigment covered up. Gold, maybe, as if it's been hidden under. As a neutral layer." Poirot nodded slowly. Lady Evelyn always wore the caraway brooch. A central ruby, teardrop-shaped. She mentioned it once as a symbol of the blood that never mixes. But here she eliminated it. And what does that imply? Poirot replied without taking his eyes off the canvas, that when painting this portrait, Lady Evelyn already knew what was coming. She had begun to erase the past even before the crime occurred. This portrait is not memory. It is a control test, rewrote her story in oil. Blount looked at him with growing unease. "Do you think he manipulated everything from the beginning?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. Finally, he said, "I don't think he ordered the murder, but he did create fertile ground for it. Like a gardener who knows that if he plants a seed of distrust next to a wall of silence, something dark will grow." That evening, Poirot returned to his apartment and sat by the fireplace with a glass of non-alcoholic liqueur. His evening cordial, as he called it. Georges left his notebook open where he had left it. Poirot looked at her. He wrote a single line. Lady Evelyn didn't commit the crime, but it was the wind that closed the door when the chandelier fell. Drenville's death, the tampered will, Isabel, the perfume, the portrait, everything had been resolved on the surface. But like any crime that stems from family history, its roots lay deeper. And Poirot, although he didn't tell anyone, felt for the first time in years that he hadn't solved a crime. I had only described its shape accurately, and that sometimes was all the world would allow him to do. Chapter 14. The Diary That Wasn't in Inventory. It was an uneventful morning at Whitehaven Mansions. Georges served breakfast with his usual precision, placing the hot coffee in the pre-warmed cup, the toast with the corners facing Poirot, and the newspaper neatly folded by date, not by section. Poirot, sitting in his favourite armchair, was leafing through an unreturned letter that had arrived in the mail. "Georges," he said in a low voice, "have you noticed anything curious these past few days?" The butler raised a barely perceptible eyebrow. "Just your silence, sir. And, if I may, it's been longer than usual." Poirot nodded. Sometimes silence is not reflection. It is what? He put the letter aside. It was short. A single sheet of paper in old-fashioned handwriting, which read, "There's a witness who hasn't spoken yet. Look where Lady Evelyn left no trace." An hour later, Poirot stepped off the train in Truro, his walking stick in hand and his moustache immaculate. This time he wasn't returning to Bellgard Manor as an investigator, but as someone who couldn't stand a single piece of the puzzle. The local inspector, alerted by telegram, was waiting for him, his face visibly contrite. "Are you referring to the final inspection of the private archives, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oui. I requested access to the complete inventory of documents seized after the crime. And I noticed an omission. An omission? Lady Evelyn's diary. She always kept one. She mentioned it in conversation. Her servants knew of its existence, and yet does not appear in the inventory. That means it was either destroyed or hidden. They were welcomed into the mansion by a newly hired young housekeeper. The house was in the process of being vacated for sale or rent, following Lady Evelyn's decision to retire to Switzerland, according to rumours." Poirot needed no guide. He walked straight to the North Wing office, the only room that hadn't been fully searched, a space Lady Evelyn used to organise charities and private correspondence. He opened the drawers with linen gloves. He rummaged through them without haste. Nothing visible. But beneath the Caraway Foundation folder, something creaked. Poirot peeled back the bottom lining. There, wrapped in a dark blue leather cover, was the diary. He opened it. The handwriting was firm, with flourishes, regular entries up to the night before the murder. Poirot read slowly, in a low voice. "Drenville is threatening. He says he'll reveal Isabel's case if I don't sign the documents. He wants control, as always. But if he falls, everything will be silent." Poirot closed the diary. His expression wasn't one of triumph, but of profound sadness. "She knew Isabel would do it," he murmured. "She didn't plan it, she didn't order it, but she allowed it, consciously, calculated, and when it happened, she wove the punishment with the same delicacy with which she wrote these pages." The inspector looked at him, pale. "Do you want us to file it as evidence?" "No, this won't change the verdict. But it should be known, in the background, that Drenville's death was also a voluntary omission of moral duty." As he left the mansion, for the last time, Poirot paused on the threshold. "In every crime, Inspector, there's more than one culprit. Some kill with objects, others with delayed decisions. Evelyn Caraway didn't lift a candle, but she did close a door. One Isabel thought she couldn't open any other way." Back in London, Poirot placed the sealed diary in a filing box alongside previously solved cases. On the cover, he wrote by hand, "The crime of the missing key, the fake perfume, and the inherited punishment." He closed the box. Then he sat down by the open window, taking a deep breath. In the distance, the bells of a church rang the hour. Poirot smiled and murmured, "Now, yes, the echo has died away." Chapter 15. The letter that was never sent toward London. 2 weeks later. Spring was timidly beginning to creep into the gardens of Regent's Park. although the morning still carried the bite of a winter that refused to fully retreat. At Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat in front of a neat pile of overdue correspondence, his cup of chamomile tea untouched on its saucer. "Georges," he said without looking up, "I have a feeling today different, as if something were about to speak, something that has been silent for so long, too much time. Intuition, sir?" Poirot shook his head gently. "No, the little grey cells, they heard a whisper. Among the envelopes and telegrams, there was one with an unmistakable letterhead, Thornbridge, and Marsh Solicitors, Cornwall County." Poirot opened it with surgical care. Inside, a note. "Monsieur Poirot, following the final inventory of Lady Evelyn Carroway's property, a hidden compartment was discovered at the base of her desk. It contained only one unsent letter. As it was addressed to you, we believe you should read it. Yours faithfully, S. Thornbridge." Poirot slowly took out the letter. The handwriting was elegant, severe, familiar. "Mr. Poirot, I know the day will come when you'll know everything, even what I've left out. Because men like you don't rest, nor do they allow the world to preserve its myths when there are truths beneath. I'm not innocent. I never was. But I was useful. I kept this family alive when everyone wanted to tear it apart. I gave it structure, I gave it silence, and I gave it acceptable ways to deal with guilt. Isabel's murder? I saw it coming. I let it happen. Maybe because I didn't know how to stop her. Or maybe because her fury was a clumsy form of justice that wasn't my job to diffuse. I know you'll judge me. I accept that. But I also know you'll understand not all crimes are punishments. Some are legacies we eventually fulfill. Evelyn Carroway." Poirot remained motionless for several long minutes. Then, delicately, he folded the letter and placed it on the mantelpiece, next to a porcelain figurine representing justice. Blindfolded, scales in hand. "She didn't want to send it," he murmured. "Not out of cowardice, but because she knew the letter was unnecessary, that I would find it anyway, and that I wouldn't judge her harshly, but accurately." That afternoon, Poirot visited Scotland Yard, at the invitation of Inspector Japp. He found him in his office, surrounded by papers, maps, and the usual cup of cold coffee. "Poirot, I didn't expect to see you so soon. Another storm in your soul?" "Just a final breeze, mon ami. I received a letter from Lady Evelyn." Japp leaned back, somewhere between curious and resigned. "And what does it say? That he knew? That he didn't stop Isabel? That he allowed the catastrophe to spread like someone who doesn't stop a fire from spreading through the bush? Is that a confession?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "It's a moral testament, one that can't be judged in a court of law. She didn't commit the crime, but she did raise the walls where it was incubated, and she left the doors open for it to happen." Japp was silent. Then he said, "And what are we supposed to do with that?" Poirot stood up. He carefully smoothed his jacket. "Nothing. It's already done. What we have to do now is remember it, because in the most complex crimes, there's no single culprit. There's a network, and sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that no one did the right thing." When he returned to Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot placed Evelyn's letter in a special box alongside the most personal documents of his career, not in the criminal file, but in the human understanding. Before going to sleep, he wrote one last note in his notebook. The unsent letter was the silent confession, not of an act, but of a way of thinking. Evelyn Carroway was not the murderer, but he was the one who set the stage, raised the curtain, and wrote the dialogue. Isabel just played her part. Poirot closed the notebook. The lights went out, and for the first time in weeks, he slept peacefully. Chapter 16. The phone. No one answered. The days following Poirot's final revelation passed with a strange stillness. There were no more mysterious envelopes or forgotten letters. But deep down, Poirot felt that the story of Bellgard Manor had not yet spoken its last word. Some truths, he knew well, did not come with force or clamour, but with a persistent emptiness. That morning, as Georges was organising the day's envelopes, a phone call interrupted the harmony of breakfast. It was unusual. Rarely did anyone call Poirot directly without warning. Georges, discreet as always, covered the receiver and said, "Monsieur, it's a Mrs. Marguerite Larchmont. She's upset." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Miss Larchmont? How peculiar. Put her on the line, please." The voice on the other end was shaky, but clear. "Monsieur Poirot, I didn't mean to do it. Believe me, I didn't. But there's something else. Something I forgot. No, I didn't forget. Wash it off." "Speak, mademoiselle, I'm listening." "The night of the crime. I was near the piano, yes, like I said. But what I didn't tell you is that before the power went out, someone called me on the West Gallery. Phone. A phone no one uses anymore. Nobody should use. And when I picked up the phone, there was only silence. A deep, dense silence, as if someone was listening. And then they hung up." Poirot closed his eyes. "And why didn't you say it before?" "Because I thought I imagined it. Because no one admitted to having called, and I didn't want to seem unstable." "Mademoiselle," said Poirot gravely, "sometimes crimes are not understood by what happens, but by what interrupts what was going to happen. You just changed a timeline." That same afternoon, Poirot again consulted the electrical plans of the Bellgard mansion. The telephone in the West Gallery was not disconnected as had been thought. It was connected to an internal line, a line that ran directly through the closed office of Lady Evelyn's deceased husband. A room that was assumed to have been sealed for years. Poirot asked the local inspector to accompany him to the mansion one last time. "What exactly are you looking for?" the inspector asked as they entered the now uninhabited East Wing. A call that was never answered, and perhaps a message that was never sent in words. The West Gallery was dark. The afternoon light barely entered through the high windows. The telephone was a black bakelite model, covered in dust, but when you picked up the receiver, you could hear "application." "Working," Poirot murmured. "But who used it?" The inspector found a small notebook in a box next to the telephone. Inside it was a single line, written in old-fashioned handwriting. "Last night, 8:14 p.m. Isabel answered. Poirot paled. "The time was right. It was a warning," he said. "Someone wanted to prevent the crime, not cover it up. Maybe Lady Evelyn. Maybe another presence in the house." The inspector approached the window. "Are you saying that someone tried to stop the murder, but failed?" "Yes. Maybe they didn't know exactly what would happen. Maybe they just sensed disaster. But they acted. They called out. They didn't speak, but they tried to interrupt. The inspector took out his notebook. So, there's someone else involved? Poirot denied. No, there's someone else, invisible, like an attempt at redemption. Someone who couldn't confess, but who couldn't stand idly by either. Back in London, Poirot wrote one last entry in his casebook. He titled it, "The Phone That No One Answered." In every crime there are visible acts, the weapon, the motive, the alibi. But there are also invisible gestures, the gaze that wanders, the object that moves, the call that doesn't arrive on time. Someone in Bellgard wanted to stop the tragedy. He didn't speak. He didn't confess. But he tried. That doesn't erase the crime, but it humanizes it. Poirot closed the notebook. Bellgard's story, like an echo, had returned once more, but this time not with violence, nor with revelations, only with a murmur, one who, at last, had been heard. Chapter 17. The Hand That Didn't Sign the Name. In the days following the discovery of the mysterious knock from the West Gallery, Poirot sank into an even deeper silence than usual. Georges, with his usual quiet intuition, didn't ask questions. He just replaced the coffee with lime-flower tea and placed philosophy books on the table instead of newspapers. Poirot, needless to say, was dusting off the soul of crime, not its mechanics. One grey morning, as the trams buzzed in the distance like metallic insects, a letter arrived from Inspector Japp. It contained a copy of Lady Evelyn's handwriting records, taken from her legal briefs and personal letters. Along with it was a brief note. "Are you sure the hand that wrote the note in the gallery was Evelyn's?" Poirot read the sentence twice. Then he looked for the notebook he had found in the West Gallery. He noticed the inscription. "Steer, night, 8:14 p.m., Isabel answered." It was brief, shaky, and overly written, the kind of handwriting that wasn't typical of Evelyn Carroway, whose handwriting was Victorian in its firmness. Poirot needed no further confirmation. "It wasn't Lady Evelyn who wrote that," he murmured. "It was someone else, someone with access to the East Wing, someone who knew about the call, and who tried to document her warning. But who?" That day Poirot visited Marguerite Larchmont at her new London lodgings. The building was modest, but adorned with dried flowers and shelves filled with gardening books. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with a mixture of surprise and modesty, "you honour me with your visit." "Mademoiselle," Poirot replied politely, "I have a simple question. Did you ever write notes in the West Gallery? A notebook by the telephone?" She hesitated for just a second. "Yes. Sometimes I wrote down messages from the garden, or the light schedules. Why?" Poirot stared at her. "Because the handwriting in that notebook is yours, not Lady Evelyn's. You were the one who recorded the time of the call." Absolute silence descended on the room. Why didn't he say it? Marguerite looked down. "Because I didn't know if what I did was helping or enabling the crime. I heard things. I was suspicious. Isabel had been nervous for days. I heard her crying more than once. I saw her walk into her aunt's office. I knew something was brewing. And when that call came, I knew it was my only chance to intervene without being seen." And sent it. Why didn't he speak when the police arrived? Because it was too late. Because no one would have believed me. I was just the eccentric piano player. Just another in the house of secrets. And besides, would arresting her have helped? She didn't need an excuse, just a moment of darkness. Poirot nodded slowly. But you left the trail, and now I've found it. Does that make me an accomplice? No, mademoiselle, that makes you the only character in this story who tried to do the right thing, without having to be seen doing it. Marguerite let out a long breath, as if she were shedding a weight. So this ends here. Poirot rose with a slight gesture of courtesy. No, but the silence that follows will no longer be a punishment. It will be a respite. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot took out his notebook and wrote, "Everyone remembers the hand that holds the gun. Few remember the hand that wanted to write an advertisement. Miss Larchmont didn't save Drenville's life, but she tried. In this tragedy, she was the only one who acted from instinct, not calculation, and that's why justice ignores it, but memory shouldn't do it." He carefully closed the notebook. He walked to his window and watched the city breathe, people passing by, unaware that the world still held traces of crimes that didn't stain clothes, but did stain souls. And deep down, he knew the story of Bellgard Manor had ended, not with a verdict, but with a silent revelation. The revelation of a hand that did not sign the name, but who, in the shadows, wanted to avoid a tragedy. Final chapter. The last truth in the fading light. It was a clear afternoon in London, one of those rare ones where the sky isn't tinged with grey, but with a warm amber that floods the rooftops and makes the windows shine like mirrors. At Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat by the open window, his hands crossed on his chest and his moustache immaculately trimmed. Beside him, the Bellgard casebook remained closed. But his mind was not yet closed. The pieces were all on the table. Drenville's death, Lady Evelyn's silent omission, Isabel's poisoned guilt, Miss Larchmont's unspoken warning, and the scattered echoes that Poirot had picked up one by one, like a gardener discovering flowers among the rubble. And yet something remained incomplete. Georges entered with his usual punctuality. "Sir, a package has arrived. No return address." From Cornwall. Poirot took it with a slight gesture. He opened it carefully. Inside was an aged leather book, with no title on the cover. Opening it revealed yellowed pages filled with musical notes, gardening, formulas, religious passages, and loose thoughts. It was a personal notebook, belonging to Lady Evelyn Carroway. On the first page, a dedication for those who understand silences as much as words. And Poirot skimmed silently. The last, more recent pages became more erratic. Reflections on legacy, on errors, on justice, and finally, a sentence underlined 3 times. The real crime was not teaching how to love, only how to inherit. Poirot slowly closed the book. Later that day, he visited Isabel in Holloway Women's Prison. He found her slim, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes dark but steady. "I didn't expect you to come, Monsieur Poirot, and yet here I am, mademoiselle, because you deserve to hear one more truth. Not mine, your aunt's." Poirot placed the book on the table. Isabel looked at it without touching it. What is it? His true will. Not the legal one, the emotional one that isn't handed over to notaries, but to consciences. Isabel opened it. She read in silence for several long minutes. Finally, she looked up, her gaze clouded but steady. She knew everything. And yet she didn't stop me, because he didn't know how. His strength was always control, but when it came to affection, he was clumsy. He didn't know how to embrace, only how to toughen up. And that absolves her. Poirot shook his head gently. No, but it humanizes her, and sometimes that's enough. He stood up. Isabel closed the book and held it against her chest. What will become of me? That will be decided by the court. But within you, another trial has already begun. That of understanding. That lasts longer, but it also redeems better. A few days later, Poirot returned to his desk in London. He lit the lamp, took out his fountain pen, and wrote the final entry in his notebook. Bellgard was not just a crime within noble walls. It was a family tragedy, of uncorrected mistakes, unexpressed emotions, and poisoned inheritances. Evelyn, Caraway didn't kill, but her silence created the atmosphere. Isabel acted, but her reasoning was shaped by years of repression. Marguerite tried to stop him, and in doing so she was the only light among the shadows. Criminal justice will punish the act, but only emotional justice can heal the root. And I, Hercule Poirot, have seen in this case not the triumph of the grey cells, but the weight of what we keep silent when we should have spoken. He put away his pen. He closed his notebook. Then he allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible sigh. He looked up at the fading sky, and with a soft voice he said only to himself, "It's over."